So why do you need compliance certification? The employment relationship is built on trust and the trust between the employer and the employee. And as much as there's trust, there's also a fair amount of risk involved. And as such, employers must make sure that they mitigate these risks as far as possible. Now, one of the ways in which you can, as an employer, mitigate your risk is to make sure that you proactively manage the performance and discipline of your employees. It's fairly common knowledge that if you don't follow the correct procedures, ultimately you are going to have to deal with either one of these or all of these bodies or systems in place that are really there for the benefit of the employee and not of the employer. The Department of Labour is a prime example of an institution who will conduct investigations and site visits and make sure that employers adhere to the relevant health and safety legislation as well as the regulations. The Department of Health will get involved as and when necessary in an attempt to mitigate risk as far as possible. In 2017, when we had the listeriosis outbreak, the Department of Health conducted their own investigations in an attempt to mitigate the risk and to reduce the spread of listeriosis. The Compensation Commissioner is really there to protect employees whenever there's an injury on duty. The Compensation Commissioner could potentially reject any claims if they find that there was negligence, and negligence in the form of an employee not trained, not adequately trained, or not certified. And then ultimately, the CCMA is there to make sure that employees are treated fairly and justly. Now, unfortunately, all of these bodies will potentially have, at some stage, a possibility of a financial outcome, and it's not for the benefit of the employer, unfortunately. So, one of the ways in which employers can manage their or mitigate their risk is to make sure that they comply with the relevant health and safety legislation, which states that any employee who works on dangerous equipment must be trained and adequately trained to do so. So, one of the ways in which you can mitigate your risk is to make sure that you comply with relevant health and safety legislation and its regulations, but also to certify the skills of your employees. And that's really the start of what we call minimum practice. Now, minimum practice is to make sure that the workplace is safe for everybody involved, and ultimately, it's it's a step in the right direction to strive towards what we call best practice. Now, best practice, as much as there's processes within the workplace, it's ultimately something that builds the trust for the consumer. And as much as there's trust, there's also a fair amount of risk involved. So consumers trust that what they buy from workplaces or businesses or employers, they trust that what they buy is safe to use, or in our case, safe to consume. Unfortunately, there's also a fair amount of risk involved for consumers. So best practice is really one of those essentially practices that is there for the benefit of the consumer. And it's advised for employers to make the consumers aware of their practices and make them aware that their people are adequately trained and they understand the implications of their actions. And that really is what brings the consumer and best practice together. So it's in the best interests of all parties involved to make sure that employees are trained and that their skills are certified. Apart from it just being a legislative compliance issue or a requirement, it's also a step in the right direction from a best practice perspective. If you'd like to know more, get in touch with us. www.meet.org.za or info@meet.org.za.